The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody, welcome to the final unit in the Lunch and Learn series. Looking forward to working with you over the next hour, and I hope you've had a lot of fun in the last fortnight applying the Understanding People and the Personalities profile. So I just wanted to start by saying you'll get a copy of the recordings, you'll get a copy of the slides at the end of this series, and that of course will be the end of our work together for the time being at least. So I'm going to talk about facilitating effective meetings today, and I guess the reason for that is that most of us, well all of us actually, attend meeting after meeting after meeting. I mean, you could argue that this is a meeting, when this is over there'll be another meeting that you've got to go and join, and yet another one, and it never ends. So obviously if we're attending a lot of meetings, there's also the need to make sure that those meetings are run as effectively and efficiently as we possibly can. Now, I realise that you don't run all of those meetings, but I dare say you probably run some of them, and certainly you will in the future. And I think that's the reason that I've put this into the Lunch and Learn series, because I think that running and facilitating meetings is an extremely important leadership capability, because it's a costly exercise, as you'll see, and I think it means that if you can actually create better meetings, you'll get better results, you'll have higher morale, you'll stand out from the crowd, because other people will say, well, you know, most of us attend so many mediocre meetings that when we attend a good one, we recognise it very quickly and appreciate it as well. So there's a whole lot of good reasons why it's important to be good at facilitating effective meetings. And it's not difficult either. That's the other important part of this. It's not a difficult exercise at all. All right, so let's launch into the topic itself. You'll notice that here are the 6 that we've gone through. I won't run through them all now. We've pretty much done those, and let me just talk about the process in general. And you'll notice that of course we've gone through feedback, we've talked about influencing capabilities, we've optimized team performance through conversation, we've talked about getting the best from other people in terms of motivating them or creating the environment by which they choose to be motivated. We've talked about people's personality, and of course today we're going to be talking about meetings. All right, so we've covered a lot of territory in several months, and I hope you found some real use out of that. So let's move on to the topic today, bearing in mind that last time we met, I asked you to complete the Understanding People and their Personalities profile, and basically to start to lead people emphasising their personality types. And I'm sure you've had a chance to do that and to practice that as such. The whole purpose of that session was really around the whole need to treat people how they want to be treated, which of course is what we referred to as the platinum rule, rather than the golden rule, which is about treating people how you want to be treated. So it's all about being able to empathise and change or adjust your personality so that you can build a better rapport up with those people that you're actually leading. So I hope you had a bit of fun with that. And as I've said in the past, I'm more than happy for you to go and use that profile to work with other people as well. All right, so what are we covering today? So let's have a look at what we're actually going to look at and cover, and then I'm going to launch into the topics as such. So I'm going to talk about the context of meetings. There are a whole bunch of different sorts of meetings that we attend, and I want to just talk about classifying those in different ways. I want to talk about the structure of meetings and how we might structure those to better use. What are some interpersonal and leadership skills that you can use in meetings to run more effective meetings? We'll look at those, and we'll look at some ideas to enrich the meeting as such. So we'll do all of those things during the course of the hour. And at any stage you've got questions or comments, you know what to do. Just type them in the question box over on the right hand side, and I'll deal with them as we get to them. Getting good at running productive meetings is one of the most critical and untapped skills of any leader. That would be my view about this. And the reason I say that, of course, is because we attend so many meetings. Our life seems to be one long meeting. And so therefore, getting good at running these meetings is obviously critical, and it's also an untapped skill. It's not something that you can learn from a book. It's not something that you can learn from experience. There's no question about that, and many people do. But of course, what also happens is people's habits remain pretty static. So they learn bad habits, and because they've never thought about it, they continue those bad habits when in fact they should be changing their approach. Okay, so let's have a look at these, and let's consider them as well. All right, so meetings themselves, if you think about it, aren't actually productive. Now, what I mean by meetings themselves aren't actually productive is that it's what happens between the meetings that make them productive. In other words, it's actually the process. Meetings are there to organise what has to happen in between meetings. The meetings themselves are not really productive. They're an organising tool. So it's really the effectiveness of the meeting is very much determined in many cases by what happens after the meeting. So obviously if a whole lot of actions are created and a whole lot of new behaviours and thinking and all the rest of it, and it can be seen to be the case, then you could actually argue that the meeting's been very effective. So I would argue that that's a very good sign that the meeting is actually an effective meeting. Now, what are the different definitions, or what are the different combinations of meetings? And let's have a look. Now, many of these, as you can see on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, we would probably have a meeting for several of these reasons, but let's just run through them and consider them, because it's important, firstly, to work out, well, what's the purpose of my meeting? What am I trying to do here? What's the ultimate aim? And what am I, because if you can't work that out, then it's likely the meeting's going to be a little confusing and not quite as effective as it could be, which is the case, no doubt. All right, so at the different types of meetings. So we've got the meetings to inform people. So these could be changes. These could be things that people are attempting to actually change in their process. There might be an announcement made, and the announcement's made, and therefore because the announcement's made, there are certain things that have to be done in order for that announcement. There is to educate people. So any training courses, you could argue that this is an education meeting, because anything where people are learning something new or perhaps reinforcing something they already knew is clearly going to be an education meeting. So training courses and so forth would fit the bill there. It might well be to clarify. So it might be to clarify some key points. So perhaps there's been some confusion in your team, or perhaps there's been some contrary information or conflicting information. So what we want to do is perhaps clarify the situation, and we might call a meeting just to do that. It could be a meeting because we want to engage people in the process. So there might be some things that we want feedback on, and we want some engagement. So those things are critically important as well. And it could be a meeting to solve collective problems. And so some collective problems that can be resolved in the meeting. They could be a whole range of possible problem-solving things where we want the team involved in that process. It could be about reviewing progress. So it could be at the end of a project where we're reviewing our progress to see what needs to happen. And so we get some feedback, or what we might refer to as an after action review. And of course, we can have meetings to make decisions, and these decisions might be critical to our success as a team. So, of course, as I mentioned, many meetings, of course, cover several of those objectives, but the important thing for you to think about before you actually conduct a meeting is, what am I trying to do here? What's the principal aim of the meeting? And work out what that is and build a meeting around that, because ultimately that's the importance of getting that right to start with. All right, so what's the actual cost of meetings? And I think this is should be quite enlightening for you, because there are significant costs associated with meetings as such. And so what I want to do is what those costs might be and what they look like. So let's start with some basic statistics. So, and of course you can do this with your team very easily. So the first thing to work out is, what's the average income of your team? So you could easily work this out. You know what they get paid, and you just work out their hourly rate. So work out, how many people, so what would the average hourly rate be in your team? Then work out how many meetings on average do your team members attend per week, and that's relatively easy to organise as well, because most people have got those meetings in their calendars, and sometimes there might be a calendar where you can actually look and see where people are, what people are up to. So typically, how long do the meetings last? And of course that's important, because some meetings are short, some meetings are long. So how long typically do they last? How many people have you got in your team? So, have you got 6 people? Have you got 3 people? Have you got 2 people? How many in the meeting as well? So that's useful as well. And what are the opportunity costs associated with that? What the opportunity costs really refer to is that when people are sitting in a meeting, and assuming they're 100% engaged in the meeting, they're obviously not able to work on other things. And because they can't work on other things, there's actually a cost to that. So in other words, if I spend an hour in a meeting and I'm completely engaged in the meeting process, then the meeting is actually costing me, although it's an hour, it's actually costing me 2 hours of my time. How so? Well, while I'm there, of course, I've taken an hour up, of course, but I've also missed an hour of doing something else. So there is actually a cost associated with attending meetings, which we call, or accountants call, an opportunity cost. Okay, so let's put some numbers around this. So let's assume that the average income in your team is, let's say it's $31.25 per person per hour. Let's assume that that's what it works out to be when the figures are done. Let's also assume that on average, your team members have about 5 meetings a week, perhaps even 1 a day. So ultimately, and that's fairly conservative from my understanding, but let's say that there are 5 meetings that each team member would have on average a week. Let's say that each meeting might go for 2 hours, and probably a lot of meetings would go for an hour, but let's assume that 10 hours of the week is absorbed in meetings. So if it was a 40-hour week, we're talking about a quarter of that time is actually spent in a meeting. Let's also assume that we have 6 people in our team, and therefore, that includes yourself. So you've got a six-person team. And of course, the opportunity costs are double. So we double the cost of all that. So I've done some calculations on those figures, which I don't think are unreasonable figures. And this is the cost here. For 6 people, the cost is actually $195,000 a year. $195,000 a year is the cost of meeting on those figures. Now that's a significant cost. Now I'm not suggesting for a minute that many of those meetings aren't important. In fact, many of those meetings there's nothing you can do about. But if we were going to spend $195,000 in a 6-person team over a year, we would want to know for sure that we're getting some value for money on that. And of course, these costs aren't in the balance sheet. You don't see them there, but the reality is that is the cost of those meetings. Now, let's just take that a step further for a moment, and let's assume that we've got an organisation with 1,000 people. And I know some people in this Lunch and Learn are from organisations that have at least 1,000 employees. So using the figures that I've given you at the bottom there and not changing any of those figures, what are we talking about over a course of a year? So for 1,000 people in an organisation, that is costing the business or the department or whatever it might be, or the not-for-profit, that's costing the organisation $32.5 million a year. Now, if you were an accountant and you were going through a budget and that figure appeared and it had next to it the title meetings, you were responsible for that budget, you may want to find out more. I'm sure you would. You'd want to find out what that $32.5 million was spent on. Was it well worth spending, and what were the considerations there? So $32.5 million. So all I'm saying here is that meetings are quite an expensive exercise, and we have to be very mindful of making sure that we are using that time valuably. I guess that's my point. Yes, we want to cut out meetings that are irrelevant, of course, but you can't cut them all out. And the ones that are relevant, we want to make sure they're even more relevant. So there's a lot of cost associated with meeting. Now, I want to talk about a couple of things about the structure of a meeting that I feel very strongly about, and some people may agree or disagree with me on this. The first thing is that it's important, not in my view at least, not to rotate the chair. I know some people would argue that it's a good thing to do. I don't think it is a good thing to do. And I say that because if you rotate the chair, and I understand the reason for doing it, that you want other people to be engaged and involved in the meetings and so on. But the reality is that most people dread the opportunity to chair the meeting. So the first thing is they're not all that happy about doing it. The second thing is they're probably not very good at doing it because they're not used to doing it. Maybe that's the reason you're doing it. But what you're going to create is some low quality meetings, which ultimately you end up chairing anyway. And so my feeling about this is don't rotate the chair. At the end of the day, I would suggest to you that this is a core leadership responsibility for you to be doing this. So I wouldn't be going down that road. I don't think it's relevant for you to do that. That is, of course, rotating the chair. But I'd be interested in your comments and feedback about that. Another principle that I would suggest to you in your meetings is to try to make sure that 50% of your meeting is reporting, which is essentially a lot of what meetings are about, but often too much, and 50% discussion. So the idea is that there would be opportunity for collaboration and discussion and problem solving, but not just a process of reporting. Because, people turn off when you've got the process of reporting around the table. People aren't necessarily giving 100% attention, and often what's happened is that useful information is lost very easily. So balancing up reporting and discussion at around 50-50 is a very reasonable principle. Now you might say to me, well, what do I discuss? There's a heap of things that you can discuss and get your team completely engaged in. It just requires you to sit down and think about that a little bit. Okay, so another principle, of course, is to make sure that you use critical incidents in your meeting. What I mean by that, if something goes extremely well, then it's important to share that with the team and to talk about how you might be able to capitalize on that in future. In other words, what's the learning out of it that might be useful? Of course, if something didn't go well and there were a few issues or there was a bit of a crisis, well, that can be discussed in a meeting as well in terms of how we might do things better, faster, easier, or whatever next time round. So you've got that opportunity to use critical incidents, and of course, the fresher the critical incidents, the more relevant it will be because it's in the forefront of people's minds. Now, this isn't an opportunity, of course, to start pointing fingers of blame or to pass responsibility. This is not. This is a constructive opportunity of being able to learn something to apply for the future. And so that's exactly what a critical incident should be about. Now, the other thing about meetings that I think people take for granted is, does everybody in your team actually know what everyone else does? Is everyone in your team actually crystal clear about the roles and responsibilities of everyone else in the team, I wonder? Are they absolutely clear about that? And if they are clear about that, well, that's great. But if they're not clear about it, then it's a problem. And I think it's easy for you as the leader of the team to make the assumption that everybody knows everybody else's role. Big mistake in my experience. So one of the things that you might like to do in a team meeting is give people an opportunity to share with the rest of the team some of the challenges and constraints and, in fact, just simply what they do. You know, what are their priorities in their role? Because let's face it, most teams, the people sitting around the table all have different functional responsibilities. So the key thing to try and do there is to tap in and find out what all those functional responsibilities are. Give people a forum to share that would be useful in a team. So effectively, you could actually ask each person for 2 to 3 minutes at each meeting to give an overview of their priorities or some of the challenges, what keeps them up at night, all that kind of stuff. And you could go around the table that way, and it could be very, very effective. Okay. So clarifying roles is very, very important. Now let's talk about those of you working in the outdoor environment. Stand-up meetings are brilliant. They work really well, and the reason they work really well is that you can get them done a lot quicker than would normally be the case. Because everybody's standing around, people will tend to get straight to the point and won't waffle on. So the point is that the meetings can be a lot quicker and more to the point. They're excellent when you're talking about changing guard or shifts. So this might be a shift meeting where one shift is finishing up, they're debriefing or they're briefing the new shift on some of the challenges that they faced. And the new shift, of course, can ask a whole bunch of questions around that to assist them to improve their approach as well. Okay, so that can work extremely well for you. Now, the other thing is, if it's worth having a meeting, it's worth having an agenda. And I think sometimes people forget this. So it's important to have an agenda, and it's important to be able to, I'm not talking about a spontaneous meeting. Obviously, you wouldn't have an agenda for that. But you would have an agenda for any meeting where you've organised it in advance, in my view. And it doesn't have to be a complicated agenda. It might be about 6 or 7 items on the list, but it is important. Now, a couple of things about agendas that work really well. One thing I'd suggest is that you make sure that you don't meet at a round time. So, for example, if you meet at 9 a.m., it's likely that people will turn up late, or 9:15. Start the meeting at 9:10. So have something a little bit unusual on the agenda, which basically implies that you are to be here on time because we're starting at 9:10. The other thing about the agenda is just have the items in order of priority. So the first is the most important item, and the sixth is the least important. And the reason for that is very simply this. By doing that, what you're doing is you're creating if you don't get through, say you only get through 4 of the 6 items, it basically means that the other 2, which of course you've already determined are less important, can go to the top of the agenda for the next meeting, but you don't want your 6th item to be the most important and leaving that off the list. So put them in order of priority. The other suggestion I'd have for you is to actually put after each agenda item a number. So put a bracket, number, bracket. So for example, I'm going to put bracket 10, close a bracket. What that signifies to the meeting is that we're only going to spend 10 minutes on that topic. And so by spending 10 minutes on that topic, it means that that topic is, it gives you a sense of control over the meeting, because if people start to waffle on, you can say to people, look, we've only allocated 10 minutes to this. Can you please get to the point? You can do that quite reasonably if the people can see in front of them that there is indeed 10 minutes for that item to be discussed. So it's a good way of being able to manage the flow of discussion in your meetings. Now, one thing you might like to consider, and I don't see it happen enough, and this is not talking about minutes. Summarising at the end of the meeting isn't necessarily talking about minutes. What it is a process of getting somebody who might have a talent in the meeting to be able to summarise the key points that have come out of the meeting so that it's fresh in everybody's mind, so that by the time everyone walks out of the room, they're very clear about, one, what has to be done, and two, who has to do it. So it's a great way of ending a meeting and to demonstrate to the people in the meeting that there is, actions that have come out of the meeting. I think that you should find somebody that's got a bit of a skill at being able to chop things up into bite-sized pieces and delegate that responsibility to them. I'm not necessarily sure that it needs to be your job, but it certainly needs to be somebody's job in the team to do that. And I think that's a good thing to do. And people walk out the door and the action steps are fresh in people's mind, and they understand that the meeting has actually created some progress towards some particular project or activity. All right, now, of course, it's true to say that when we have a meeting, we start the meeting off and the energy level is usually quite, it's reasonably high to start with because people are fresh, depends on what time of the day it is or evening. And as the meeting progresses, the energy level drops off. And what you find is that people will have a tendency to, so you don't, I guess the point of this is you don't want to be making critical decisions at the end of your meeting. Make sure that those critical decisions, as I mentioned earlier, are made up front while people's energy levels are high and they're ready to go, and they can continue along those lines. And so a good rule of thumb, an hour is a good rule of thumb for most meetings, my suggestion would be. Now, of course, how you set the room up is critically important to the type of input and interaction you get from people. So you've got theatre style up in the top left-hand corner. Now, for those sorts of meetings, these would be like shareholder meetings, and you can see that there's a group of dignitaries out the front. And those people, of course, are there to address the group or the crowd. You'll notice that its great strength is that the focus is on the head table and the 4 people at the front. The great weakness of that approach, of course, is there's very little, if any, interaction between the audience. So if you wanted a meeting where you wanted to collaborate on something, that wouldn't be a very useful approach. The second one, going clockwise, would be the classroom style. And the difference here is that there are desks, and this would be ideal for when people are learning from an expert at the front of the room and they need to take notes or tap things into their laptop or iPad or whatever it is. That way it can be very effective because there's a space for them to actually record things conveniently. But again, the weakness is that you would not get much interaction between the people at the meeting there because they're not facing each other. Now, the U shape is very popular for sort of training courses, I find, and the U-shape is quite effective, but it's only effective where you have, it's only effective, because the reason it's effective is that you're getting people, at least most of the team are facing each other across the room at least. So it's quite good for interaction between team members, and you get people talking in amongst themselves. The leader can still be at the front, and the leader can still, make their point at different times. But ultimately, it does create an opportunity for dialogue to occur within the team as such. The cabaret style is one of my favourites when I'm running workshops, and the reason why it's so good is that you've got complete interaction within 4 teams there, and the idea is that you can present a topic or a problem for the team members, and they can go away and resolve it in their own tables and around their own, tables as such. So that can be very effective use there. The weakness of that, of course, is that sometimes you can create side conversations that perhaps are detrimental because you're trying to say something up front. Now, the banquet style, of course, is more of a formal style that may well be used at a dinner, a graduation dinner or something like that, where you may have a speaker up the front. There are a number of dignitaries that need to be acknowledged at a head table, but you've got people in sort of groups facing each other, so that can be quite effective when you've got a guest speaker over dinner or something along those lines. Okay, so the final one is the conference style, where you've got everyone sitting around a table, and that probably is the one that you're using for your team meetings, I suspect. And it's a very good approach because it gives everyone a chance to hear everybody else and to be able to contribute to the conversation at different points. And so, yes, it's not a bad approach for team meetings, or small team meetings at least. So I just wanted to share that with you because I think sometimes setting up the room has some huge implications for how the meeting will be run. And obviously, if you have the wrong setup for a certain type of meeting, then you're going to find that it's going to lead to a suboptimal, outcome for the team as such. Now, I strongly recommend that you use guest speakers at your meeting. Now, when we're not talking about motivational speakers here, I'm talking about people who could perhaps talk for 5 or so minutes, who may be from another department in your organisation, or perhaps they might be from outside the organisation and they want to share certain information with your team. And that can be very powerful for breaking down boundaries between silos or in functions in areas. So ask them to come along to the meeting and to share their view. Can be very, very effective. Okay, so that can work extremely well for you. Okay, and of course they don't have to speak for long periods of time, and you might have a Q&A at the end. It breaks up the meeting, it makes it fairly interesting. It gives other people a platform or a forum to be able to raise things with your team that are critically important to their own success as well. So that's what I mean, an internal person, maybe a person from HR, or maybe someone from marketing, or someone from sales or whatever, can come in and brief the team on something that's of interest, of mutual interest. Now, a couple of skills to think about when you're actually, involving yourself in meetings. The skill of paraphrasing is critically important in any communication, but more importantly in teams and meetings. And the reason for that is that when you paraphrase, which is essentially in your own words explaining what you've already heard. So you might say, so in other words, you had difficulty getting the right information because you approached the wrong person. Now, they might have spent 15 minutes talking about that, but ultimately that is the gist of what they're saying. Now, you do that for 3 reasons. I mean, the very first reason that you would do that is so that you can check to make sure that you have actually heard the speaker correctly. So it's obviously courtesy to do that. Secondly, it lets the speaker know, of course, that you have actually heard them, assuming, of course, you've got it right. And that's a good thing. And I guess the third thing when it comes to facilitating meetings is that by doing that, you can now move the meeting on, and you can do that very effectively. How so? Well, if you paraphrase somebody in a meeting, what you're doing is you can then move the meeting to you can then actually move on to the next agenda item without any problem whatsoever, and that works really well for you as well. All right, so paraphrasing is a really valuable tool for team leaders who are facilitating meetings. So getting people involved in your meetings is really important, and it's often a bit of a challenge for lots of people because they wonder how to do that. We've always got the perennial quiet person in the team, and we've also got the person who we can't really shut up. And both of those offer you opportunities to be able to basically change things. So for those people who you can't shut up, well, of course, a couple of key things I've given you already. If you've got a agenda item with a limited time to it, you can remind the person that they've only got 2 minutes before our time's up to move on to the next agenda item, or you can simply use what we just went through, which was the paraphrasing technique. Can be very effective. Now, what about the ones that you can't get to speak, which arguably can be more challenging? Well, what you do with those people is you ask them a question. You directly ask them a question, not in an embarrassing way, not to create some sort of a problem, but you might say to Mary, Mary, is there anything that you would like to add to the conversation? Now, by saying that to Mary, Mary may well say no, and that's fine. You have to accept that. But it also does offer Mary an opportunity to say something that might be of relevance. So Mary does have that opportunity to do that, which is good news. Okay, so that works well. Now, of course, it also lets everybody else in the team know that in fact you are putting everybody on notice that at any time during the meeting you may call upon them to give their feedback or comment. So you see, it's extremely powerful because it just reminds people that you're all expected to contribute in the meeting in one format or another. So that's a way of actually getting the quieter members of the team involved in the conversation. You can also use a team values charter, which works extremely well, which came from my book, The New Influencing Toolkit. And you can simply go round the table and ask people to record their answers to these 5 questions. The first question is, what is one value that's important to you when we meet? Right, so it might be respect, or it could be, I don't know what it could be, but you ask people to write that down. You ask them to explain what it means. So if they write down respect, what does that actually mean? So we get some examples of that. Why is it important is really a case of asking people to, it's important to know why people consider that thing to be important. What behaviours would demonstrate that value? So, what are the behaviours that might actually demonstrate the value itself? So, these are the practical symptoms of following that value. And the last one is the opposite. What behaviours would violate that value, which is normally the opposite behaviour. So you get everybody to do that, and you do it yourself as well. And then what you do is you go around the table and ask people to give you the answers to those 5 questions. and you listen, and you'll find you can hear a pin drop. It is that powerful. People are really into that activity. And that's a great thing to do to improve the quality of your meetings by getting your team members involved in the solutions for that. So it can work extremely well. The other thing I suggest, and it's so simple to do, is just have what we might refer to as a win for the week. Now, a win for the week ultimately is a very simple exercise. A win for the week is just a process where you go around the table at the beginning of the meeting and ask each person to identify one positive thing that's occurred during the last week, or however long it's been for you to meet. Now, when you do this initially, of course, people will look at you in a very strange way, and because they're not used to talking about positives, are they, in the workplace? But by doing this, you're creating an upward spiral of positivity, and that's a good thing. And then, of course, you're going to be talking about the things that aren't working particularly well shortly. We'll get to that, but let's talk about the things that are working well. And you'll find that people will really latch onto that, and it creates a really positive start to your meeting. It's fun. It's interesting to hear what people have got to say. It helps improve communication across the team, and it only goes for about 5 minutes, so it's not intruding significantly into the agenda of other items. I'd still have that as an agenda item, win for the week at the top, so people are reminded to come along and be and talk about something that they consider to be a win for the week. Okay, so folks, that's it from me. I hope you've enjoyed the series. I've enjoyed working with you, and thank you very much for the opportunity of doing that. And the homework that I'd give you is obviously to implement some of those ideas into your own meeting schedules so that you can try things, whether it's win for the week, or whether it's the team values charter, or whether it's balancing reporting and discussion, whatever it might be, or just doing a bit of an audit on the cost of your meetings in your area. All of those things could be useful. So thanks everyone. I've enjoyed working with you, and I'll sign out at this stage, and we look forward to seeing you next time we meet. Thanks everyone, and all the best. Thank you and goodbye.